All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for participating and for your interest in NCSEA's policy work. I'm Betsy McCorkle, NCSEA's Director of Government Affairs. I have a few housekeeping items to go over quickly before we begin. As questions occur to you during our presentation and discussion, please submit them via the webinar dashboard that appears on your screen. Or click on the small hand icon on your screen to raise your hand, and then you'll be called on at the appropriate time. I'd also like you to know that we've muted everyone's line in an attempt to block out any background noise. If you raise your hand or submit a question, your line will be unmuted at the appropriate time. We're also recording today's webinar, which will be posted on our website and emailed to you along with the slide deck presented today in the next couple of days. So now to jump in, for the third year in a row, NCSEA has partnered with Fallon Research to conduct a public opinion poll of North Carolina registered voters focused on energy sources, costs, and policies. This year's poll surveyed 803 registered voters and was representative of the state's political makeup. I'll now turn things over to Paul Fallon, President of Fallon Research, who will present to you the findings of this poll.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Let me go ahead and get started. My name is Paul Fallon, and let me begin by telling you a little bit about the survey itself. First and foremost, it was conducted among 803 registered voters in the state of North Carolina. That is, they weren't just people, they were adults, and they weren't just adults. They're people who are registered to vote within the state. The interviews themselves were done through a combination of valid residential and cellular telephone listings. And the reason that we do that is to ensure that cellular telephone inclusion assures us that we have participation among those people who no longer have residential landline service. This is to avoid what's known as a coverage error in survey research. The estimated overall margin of sampling error is plus or minus 3.45%, with a confidence interval of 6.9% within which the results could vary, or 7%, if you will. This just means that if we asked on a survey, for example, what is your favorite topping on a pizza? If 50% of the respondents said it's pepperoni, because of sampling variability, that number could be as low as 46.5% to as high as 53.5%. The interviews were conducted during the period of January 27th through January 31st, so this is very recent data. And the data was stratified so that differences in vital characteristics such as age, race, gender, and geography are represented in proportion to their percentages of the electorate. And this is done to prevent over or undersampling from in any way distorting the results. Survey was commissioned by the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, our hosts for this morning's webinar. And let me point out that due to rounding, not all results add up to 100%, and the data is going to be presented in a slightly different order than the questions were asked in order to create some subject-specific modules. Let me begin first by talking a little bit about the opinion environment. One of the first questions we asked on the survey is, generally speaking, would you say that North Carolina is going in the right direction, or has it gotten off onto the wrong track? The reason that I and other opinion researchers and political pollsters typically start with this question is because it's an easy question to answer and it acclimates respondents to the survey-taking process. That is, it trains them to participate. And normally this is not a question that we place a lot of importance on, although there is something interesting afoot that we wanted to share with you. As you can see from the aggregate results, 44% of the respondents say the state's moving in the right direction, 34% say it's gotten off onto the wrong track, 6% of the respondents volunteered mixed opinions, and 16% were unsure. While that 44% right direction figure is by no means stratospheric, ideally you want it to be in the 60% range. As you can see from the results, this is actually a dramatic change over the past couple years. When we asked this very same question in 2012, 31% said the state was moving in the right direction, compared to 34% in 2011. So this suggests that the tide is turning a little bit and voters are suddenly becoming a little bit more optimistic about the future. We also asked in what's known as a forced choice battery, what respondents think should be the top priority for state leaders and elected officials in North Carolina to work on right now. And what we're trying to do is get a sense of the hierarchy of priorities, if you will. First and foremost, at 35%, is attracting more businesses and jobs to the state. On the second plateau, you've got improving the quality of public education at 25%, and reducing the cost of living for items like food, fuel, and energy at 15%. On the third plateau, you've got lowering taxes. On the fourth plateau, at 3%, you've got fighting crime, and at 2%, preventing home foreclosures. Another 7% of respondents volunteered other extraneous answers, and 3% of the respondents were unsure. We also asked, generally speaking, would you say that rates that consumers and businesses are charged for power and electricity are too high, mostly pretty fair, or too low? As you can see, a narrow majority of respondents at the time the survey was taken said too high at 51%, 40% said pretty fair, 1% too low, and 8% said unsure. Among those, as you can see, those numbers have been pretty stable over the last 3 years that we've conducted the survey. The results were at 55% in 2012 and 55% in 2011. So that number has been pretty consistent during the course of this survey process. We also asked, over the past few years, do you think that the prices that consumers and businesses are charged for power and electricity have increased, stayed about the same, or decreased? And clearly there's no ambiguity here. 70%, nearly 3/4, say that the costs have increased. Only 23% say they've stayed the same. 1% said they've decreased, and 6% were unsure. Among those 70% who said they've increased, they were asked a follow-up question in a forced choice battery, which posed to them the question, which of the following would you say is the biggest reason you think they have increased? The first and most frequently occurring response at 36% was power companies increasing their profits. On the second plateau at 21%, we have inflation in the economy. We also at 15%, we've got increased costs for fuel recovery, production, and processing. On the third plateau, we've got political instability and war overseas at 7%. At 6%, we've got renewable energy mandates. And at 5%, we've got more power usage by homes and businesses. We also had a number, 4% of the respondents volunteering a combination of those responses, 3% giving extraneous answers, and 4% of the respondents were unsure. Clearly here, the lion's share of the respondents, or pardon me, a sizable plurality anyways, think that the increase in costs is due to the profits of power companies. Now looking at energy policies for a moment, we asked, do you agree or disagree that state leaders and elected officials in North Carolina should seek more alternative and renewable energy sources in order to provide consumers and businesses with power and electricity? Whopping 83% agreed, 12% disagreed, and 6% were unsure. And the reason I put a little bit of rhetorical emphasis on that is that's an exceedingly high number, especially in a democratic political environment. You rarely see that kind of consensus about a policy mandate, if you will. Looking at the data by party, 76% of Republicans agree, 89% of Democrats, as well as 82% of political independents, that is, people who are neither registered as Republicans nor Democrats. So while there's some variation by party, nevertheless well above the 50% threshold for all three partisan groups. By age, there were some interesting findings because it reached its peak among 18 to 29-year-olds at 91%. And it slowly cascades downward to 85% for 30 to 44-year-olds, 83% for 45 to 59-year-olds, and hits its nadir, if you will, at 79% for respondents 60 and older. But that's still very high. Nevertheless, there are some intriguing differences by age group. We also asked about the REPS law. Let me read to you the preamble, and then I'll share with you the results of the questions that followed it. In 2007, a new law was adopted to create new clean energy jobs in the private sector, make it easier to attract private investments for development of new technologies, improve public health by requiring greater reliance on renewable energy and energy efficiency, and use more of the energy resources that are available within North Carolina. Generally speaking, do you think that this law is a good idea or bad idea? 70% of the respondents said they thought it was a good idea, 17% said it was a bad idea, and 14% were unsure. As you can see, there were some differences by party. 66% of Republicans said it was a good idea, compared to 74% of Democrats and 67% of political independents or unaffiliated respondents. But again, that's still well above the 50% threshold. By age, once again, we saw some generational differences at work here. It was deemed a very good idea by 82% of 18 to 29-year-olds, and it cascades downward to 73% for 30 to 44-year-olds and 45 to 59-year-olds, and drops down to 63% for respondents 60 and older. When you look at the data over a 3-year period of time, the numbers have remained fairly stable. There's been a little bit of fluctuation, but not anything that I would deem to be dramatic. It was 68% in 2012 and 79% in 2011. We also asked a question which poses respondents, as a result of this law, customers pay less than $1 more per month on their electric bills. Does this make your opinion of the law more favorable, less favorable, or does it have no effect? 17% said it made their opinions more favorable. 11% said it made their opinions of the law less favorable. 69%, a sizable majority, were largely unfazed by it, saying it had no effect on their views of the law, and 4% of the respondents were unsure. We also asked respondents, do you agree or disagree with people who say that there should be more options for providing and purchasing power and electricity from other companies in North Carolina to ensure that rates are competitive and that energy providers are responsive to the needs of their customers and the general public? 83% agreed. When we broke the data down by party, something interesting occurred, and that is the differences were not statistically significant. Although agreement reached 82% with Republicans, 83% with Democrats, and 86% of independent or unaffiliated respondents, when we did what's known as statistical significance testing, we found out that there was an unacceptably high probability that those differences were just due to chance. In layman's terms, what that means is statistics show that this result was a consistent one across the board. There were, however, statistically significant differences by age group once again. 90% of 18 to 29-year-olds agreed, compared to 88% of 30 to 44-year-olds, 85% of 45 to 59-year-olds, and 77% of respondents 60 and older. We also asked, do you agree or disagree with people who say, when we asked this same question in 2012, the responses were almost identical. 85% agreed, 10% disagreed, and 5% were unsure. So these numbers mirror the results of last year. We also asked, would you support or oppose new legislation that would allow other energy companies besides Duke Energy and Progress Energy to also sell power and electricity services directly to consumers and businesses in North Carolina to create more market competition? 85% support the law, 10% oppose it, and 6% were unsure. These numbers, once again, were almost identical to the results we got in 2012 when we asked the same question, with 87% supporting it last year, 9% opposing it, and 4% being unsure. We also asked, if the state legislator who represents your community voted for the new legislation that would create more opportunities for alternative energy companies that use sustainable and renewable energy resources, such as the sun and wind, to offer power and electricity services directly to consumers and businesses in North Carolina, would you be more likely or less likely to reelect him or her, or would it make no difference in your decision? As you can see, overall 45% would be more likely, just 9% would be less likely, 42% said it made no difference, and 4% were unsure. What this suggests is that there is no political price to be paid for supporting such legislation. On the contrary, in fact, for many legislators, this could be a virtue that could bolster their prospects for re-election. There were statistically significant differences by party. It was less compelling among Republican respondents, for whom just 36% were more likely to re-elect such a legislator, compared to 52% of Democratic respondents and 47% of independents. There was also a statistically significant difference by age. 41% of 18 to 29-year-olds were more likely to re-elect such a legislator, compared to 51% among 30 to 44-year-olds, 47% of 45 to 59-year-olds, and 42% of respondents 60 and older. And despite the variation among partisans and age groups, nevertheless, this is at a minimum even for those groups that were not particularly enamored of it, it was a neutral attribute, and for most it was a beneficial one. When we asked the same question in 2012, the responses once again were almost identical, well within the estimated margin of sampling error's confidence interval, with 48% saying they'd be more likely to re-elect such a legislator, 8% saying they'd be less likely, 40% saying it made no difference, and 4% being unsure. Now looking for a moment at alternative energy sources, we asked, do you support or oppose using coal to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residents and businesses in North Carolina? A narrow majority, 56%, said they support it, 36% oppose it, and 8% were unsure. On that same plateau of popularity, 54% of respondents said they would support using nuclear power to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residents and businesses in North Carolina. 34% would oppose it, and 13% were unsure. By comparison, 88% of the respondents said they would support using solar power to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residences and businesses in North Carolina. Just 10% opposed it, and only 2% were unsure. There's a very low percentage of what we call non-opinions here, which suggests that this is highly popular and there's very little ambivalence about this particular idea. We also did something known as split sample testing, in which we programmed the computer to randomly assign respondents to one of two question versions. For example, respondents in version A were asked, do you support or oppose using offshore windmills, which would be located 15 to 50 miles off the North Carolina coastline in order to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residences and businesses in North Carolina? 76% support that proposal, 15% oppose it, and 9% were unsure. The other half of the respondents were asked about the same topic, but using a different version and testing it from a different conceptual approach. They were asked, do you support or oppose using land-based windmills, which would be located in rural or agricultural areas in order to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residences and businesses in North Carolina? This received support among 81% of the respondents, with 13% opposing it and 6% being unsure. And let me point out that when we did statistical significance testing, these differences did not meet the threshold for statistical significance, so we could not hypothesize that these differences are due to anything other than chance. Looking at some other proposals, 83% of respondents said they support using natural gas to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residences and businesses in North Carolina. 12% oppose it, and 5% were unsure. 79% of respondents say they support or oppose using natural resources such as landfill gas, wood chips, and agricultural byproducts to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residences and businesses in North Carolina. 11% oppose it, and 11% were unsure. And 87% support using energy efficiency such as installing energy-saving light bulbs, programmable thermostats, or Energy Star certified appliances to reduce energy use to meet growing needs for energy and electricity to residences and businesses. 9% opposed it, and 3% were unsure. So what was evident from this various battery of tests looking at forms of energy is that the renewable energy sources were much more popular than some of the traditional ones that North Carolinians have relied on in the past. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor back over to our host, Betsy, and she will provide some comments as well as open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Paul. A couple of questions have come in, so I'll go ahead and give you those. And then as other attendees, if you have questions, if you would like to submit them, or you're welcome to raise your hand and I will unmute you either way. So the first question that came up was about the use of the term forced battery. You mentioned that on a couple of questions. Paul, would you mind kind of explaining what that is and if that means that there were other options available or not?
Sure. The forced choice battery is one in which we provide the response options to the respondents in a rotating fashion. And some do deviate, but most choose from them. And those were selected based on past information that we know from other surveys and other types of opinion research testing to be the ones that are weighing most heavily on the minds of North Carolinians. Other questions?
There was a question that came in about natural gas, and I don't know that the poll addressed this, but the question was whether or not this was natural gas native to North Carolina or natural gas that had been piped in. But I don't know that the poll went into that level of detail, but I'll allow you to respond to that.
No, we did not distinguish that in this case, although that would be an interesting question for future studies. I'm not sure that consumers would be knowledgeable enough to differentiate between the two or be able to talk about opinions differentiating them, but nevertheless, it's an intriguing question.
Okay. I am looking through some of the other questions. Another question that was asked was the questions about using coal and nuclear to meet our growing energy needs. What can we deduce from this about using existing facilities or the need to build new facilities? And I can take a stab at that. I would make the argument that having voter public opinion data is very important in engaging support for new technologies. However, this poll really didn't provide a lot of information about you know, the existing electric grid or the feasibility, financial feasibility, political feasibility of building new facilities. It just simply looked at how the public felt about generating power from different kinds of energy sources.
I would agree. There's nothing within this survey that can draw conclusions about that particular topic.
Another question was asked, how will NCSEA be using this information? And this information, along with a recent study that was released by RTI International and Le Capra Associates, this information will be distributed to the media as well as to legislators who are looking at all of the above energy strategies, so that they will not only have information about the economics of using different kinds of energy sources, but they will also have some insight into how their constituents and their voters feel about these particular issues. Another question for you, Paul. The question was, what is the demographic makeup of the registered voters? What percentage of the population does this represent?
It doesn't represent the population. As I mentioned at the outset of the briefing, this is a survey of registered voters, and the data is stratified by age, gender, geography, party, and other demographic characteristics to be representative of them, but not the general population. And there may be some differences between voters and the general population when it comes to attitudes about energy, and more specifically about consumer issues such as the cost of energy. So this is not intended to represent views of the general population. These are voters. But this is a highly regulated field, and these are the decision makers as registered voters. These are people who have policy preferences and elect state legislators who implement those policy preferences.
Okay, another question from you, Paul, that you may have seen through going through these results. Is it safe to say that respondents will support any generating technology which is likely to improve the economy and bring jobs to North Carolina?
Yes, especially one that's deemed to be a clean technology such as a renewable resource. They're particularly popular, especially with younger voters. But impressively, one thing that the data suggested throughout is even older, somewhat hidebound voters who may have a longer life experience with more traditional technologies are starting to understand the value of these renewable resources.
Okay, another question for you, Paul. Was the poll able to capture how respondents show relative support for energy sources? For example, they might support coal, natural gas, and solar, but they would prefer solar if given a choice.
We did not pose a question like that during the survey. I think it'd be a fascinating thing to do, but we were testing such a wide range of topics individually that we did not juxtapose any of them to force respondents to choose one or the other. I'm not sure what the results would yield.
Okay, another question. Are the results stratified by ethnicity or income level?
Not by income, but they are by ethnicity. Yeah, I don't think we asked it. We did not ask income in this survey, I believe, but this is stratified by age, race, gender, geography, partisanship.
Okay, well, we are coming towards the end of our time this morning. I did want to thank Paul for his time today, as well as this excellent work that was done by his firm, and thank all of our attendees for their attendance and participation today. You will be receiving an email very soon that includes access to today's webinar and a summary of the poll's findings. We encourage you to share this information in op-eds to your local paper, as well as through your websites and social media outlets. Also, feel free to contact NCSEA directly with any questions about this survey. And again, we greatly appreciate your time, and you'll be hearing from us very soon.